Bullies choke a student until he passes out the next day. He got brutal revenge. They assumed he was defenseless until they attempted to choke him and realized their fatal miscalculation. Ethan Cole had discovered early in life that silence often proved the most strategic response. At 17, he carried himself with an unremarkable presence that most overlooked entirely. Standing at average height with a lean, athletic build, his brown eyes seemed to absorb the world around him rather than project anything outward. His sandy hair fell across his forehead in waves that often obscured those observant eyes, which catalogued everything despite his reserved nature. His movements possessed a fluid quality that others mistook for the careful gait of someone trying to avoid attention. They had no conception that each step, each gesture resulted from years of rigorous training that had become as instinctive as breath itself. The relocation to Westfield had come without warning, driven by his father's military reassignment to the installation 20 miles outside town. Colonel James Cole embodied a philosophy centered on preparation, discipline, and the variety of quiet strength that required no announcement. From Ethan's earliest years, his father had immersed him in Brazilian jiu-jitsu principles, not as instruments of aggression, but as tools for protection and self-mastery. The most capable person in any room, his father would remind him during their training sessions in their converted garage, is frequently the one who never needs to demonstrate it. Ethan had achieved his black belt at 15, an accomplishment accompanied by a solemn commitment to his father. Never initiate conflict, never amplify violence, and always pursue de-escalation when circumstances permitted. The belt transcended mere recognition of technical proficiency. It embodied years of mental conditioning, of mastering not merely his physical form, but his emotions, his ego, his rage. His father had ensured he comprehended that exceptional capability demanded exceptional responsibility, and that genuine martial artistry measured itself not in victories claimed, but in confrontations avoided. Yet Westfield High seemed purposefully constructed to challenge every principle his father had instilled. The campus sprawled across former agricultural land, its weathered brick structures connected by covered passages offering minimal shelter from bitter autumn winds. Erected in the late 70s and displaying every year of its existence, Westfield contained nearly 2,000 students within a labyrinthine network of corridors that appeared to reconfigure themselves according to the social dynamics flowing through them. The cafeteria operated as contested territory of invisible boundaries, each table claimed by distinct factions with unspoken yet rigorously maintained borders. Athletes controlled the central area, their varsity jackets and assured laughter establishing dominance like pack animals. Academic achievers congregated near windows, their textbooks and devices constructing barriers against intrusion. Art students occupied the distant corner, their vibrant attire and energetic conversations marking them as simultaneously separate from and superior to mainstream culture. And then existed the predators. Blake Sterling commanded his domain from a table positioned near the kitchen access point, a tactical location permitting him and his followers to monitor everyone entering or exiting. At 18, Blake possessed the build of the linebacker he'd been before academic suspension terminated his football participation. Broad shoulders, thick neck, hands appearing capable of crushing aluminum without effort. His blonde hair maintained perfect styling, his clothing expensive enough to broadcast his family's wealth, his smile sharp enough to draw blood when he detected vulnerability. Blake had repeated junior year, a circumstance that seemingly amplified his sense of entitlement and his compulsion to establish dominance over those he perceived as inferior. He wielded intelligence in dangerous ways, sufficiently clever to understand precisely how far he could push before crossing boundaries that would trigger genuine consequences, charismatic enough to accumulate followers who would execute his intentions while keeping his own involvement plausibly deniable. His primary lieutenant was Ryan Walsh, a junior who compensated for unremarkable size with almost pathological enthusiasm for inflicting pain. Where Blake calculated, Ryan acted impulsively. Where Blake savoured psychological dimensions of intimidation, Ryan preferred immediate gratification from physical suffering. His red hair seemed to complement his temperament, and his freckled face could transition from innocent bewilderment to malicious delight within heartbeats. The third core member was Kevin Price, a senior whose family money had purchased everything except genuine respect. Tall and lean, with prematurely receding brown hair, Kevin represented the type who would never possess courage to bully independently, but thrived within pack safety. He served as Blake's eager affirmation, laughing excessively at unfunny jokes and agreeing too readily with opinions he'd never independently formed. Completing their circle were various peripheral members who rotated depending on their utility to Blake's schemes. There was Michael Hayes, a sophomore desperate for acceptance who would attempt almost anything to prove his value. Nicole Hart, whose cutting remarks and social media reach made her invaluable for psychological campaigns. Chris Anderson, a junior whose size proved useful for intimidation, despite lacking intelligence for anything beyond muscle. These were the architects of suffering at Westfield High, and Ethan Cole had unknowingly marked himself from the moment he'd crossed the school's threshold. His initial day had been an exercise in careful observation. Ethan had learned long ago to assess environments, to comprehend the currents of power and influence flowing beneath surface interactions. In military communities where he'd matured, survival frequently depended on rapidly identifying who possessed authentic authority versus who merely generated noise. Westfield differed only in that stakes seemed simultaneously lower and higher. No lives hung in balance, yet the social annihilation resulting from wrong alliances or displaying weakness at inopportune moments could persist for years. He'd selected a table near the cafeteria's rear, close enough to observe yet distant enough to avoid immediate notice. His lunch was simple. A sandwich his father had prepared that morning, an apple, bottled water. He ate methodically, eyes constantly moving, cataloguing faces and relationships, noting who conversed with whom and who received careful avoidance. That's when he'd first witnessed Blake's group operating. Their target had been a sophomore named David Park, exactly the variety of student who attracted predators. Small for his age, obviously intelligent yet socially awkward, wearing clothing that marked him as different in an environment where conformity equaled safety. He'd been sitting alone with a book while eating lunch, completely unaware of the approaching storm. Blake had approached wearing his characteristic smile, the one never reaching his eyes. "Hey there, David. What are you reading?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Ethan could perceive the predatory stillness settling over Blake's group. How other students at neighbouring tables had suddenly found their own meals fascinating, unwilling to witness what would unfold. David had glanced up, hope flickering in his eyes at what might constitute genuine interest. "It's about theoretical physics. There's this fascinating chapter on quantum entanglement." "Quantum entanglement," Ryan had interrupted, his voice saturated with false amazement. "That sounds super exciting. Doesn't it sound exciting, guys?" The chorus of agreement had been perfectly orchestrated, each voice layered with sufficient sarcasm to clarify they were mocking David without being obvious enough for nearby adults to notice. David's face had begun flushing as realization dawned. But Blake wasn't finished. "You know what, David? You're so intelligent. Maybe you can help us with something. We've been wondering, what's the quantum probability of you getting laid before graduation?" Laughter had erupted from Blake's table and spread to nearby groups, each person afraid not to participate lest they become the next target. David's face had transitioned from red to white as he'd grabbed his book and attempted departure. But Ryan had been prepared for that, casually stepping into his path while pretending distraction by something across the cafeteria. "Oh, sorry, man," Ryan had said as David bounced off his chest. "Didn't see you there. You're so small. You're practically quantum-sized yourself." More laughter. David had looked around desperately, seeking help everyone was too frightened to provide. His eyes had met Ethan's for just a moment, and Ethan had seen something in them that made his hands clench involuntarily. A plea for help, for someone, anyone, to intervene and stop this. But Ethan had remained seated, had taken another bite of his sandwich and looked away, following his father's teachings about avoiding unnecessary conflict, about maintaining invisibility until comprehending the full situation. It was the smart move, the tactical move, the move preserving his safety and anonymity. It was also the move that haunted him for the next 3 weeks as he watched Blake's group systematically dismantle David Park's daily existence. They were artists in their cruelty, Ethan had to acknowledge. They never left evidence, never crossed lines that would summon administrative attention, never did anything that couldn't be explained as harmless fun between friends. But they transformed David's life into living hell with precision, speaking to extensive practice and natural talent for psychological warfare. They would accidentally collide with him in hallways, sending his materials flying. They would reserve seats at tables David was approaching, then relocate entirely, leaving him standing alone with his lunch tray. They would pose questions in class sounding supportive but designed to make him appear foolish or set him up for public humiliation later. The worst aspect was how they made other students complicit in their campaigns. Through combinations of fear and social pressure, they'd created an environment where helping David or any of their targets became a risk most people weren't willing to accept. They had weaponized natural teenage fear of becoming outcasts, transforming it into a tool that made the entire student population into either active participants or passive enablers of their behavior. Ethan had observed it all with mounting discomfort, recognizing in their tactics some identical psychological manipulation techniques he'd studied in his father's military psychology texts. These weren't random acts of teenage meanness. They were systematic campaigns designed to erode targets' self-esteem and support systems, to isolate them and render them vulnerable to further abuse. His father had taught him about such tactics in contexts of enemy interrogation and psychological warfare. To witness them employed by teenagers against other teenagers in what should constitute a safe educational environment was simultaneously fascinating and deeply disturbing. But Ethan had maintained his distance, had kept his head down and mouth shut, had followed his father's teachings about avoiding unnecessary conflict. He was the new student after all. He didn't understand the complete dynamics of the school's social ecosystem. Involvement could make him a target, could complicate his father's military career if incidents required disciplinary action. Better to remain invisible, to focus on academics, to navigate his senior year without incident. That strategy had functioned for exactly 3 weeks and 2 days. It had been a Tuesday morning, grey and cold with snow threatening, when Ethan had made the mistake of attracting Blake Sterling's attention. He'd been at his locker retrieving textbooks for first period when he'd heard commotion down the hallway. A group of students had gathered in a rough circle, the formation usually signifying either a fight or someone being humiliated for others' entertainment. Ethan had glanced over, his trained situational awareness automatically cataloguing potential threats and escape routes when he'd seen David Park in the circle's centre. The smaller boy was on hands and knees, frantically collecting scattered papers, while Blake's group stood around him, occasionally kicking a paper just beyond reach whenever David got close to grabbing it. "Come on, David," Trevor had been saying, his voice carrying false concern that had become his signature. "We're just trying to help you organize your homework. Can't have you being unprepared for class." Ryan had added his own contribution by stepping on a paper just as David reached for it, grinding his heel slowly back and forth. "Oops, sorry buddy, didn't see that one there." The gathered students had laughed, but it was the nervous, uncomfortable laughter of people afraid not to participate. Ethan could see it in their faces, the knowledge they were witnessing something wrong, combined with fear that intervening would make them next targets. David had looked up from his position on the floor, his face flushed with humiliation and something that might have been tears, and his eyes had found Ethan's again. This time the plea was even more desperate, more urgent. "Help me," those eyes had said. "Please, someone help me." And Ethan had looked away again, had turned back to his locker and focused on his textbooks, telling himself this wasn't his fight, that he couldn't save everyone, that getting involved would only worsen things for everyone. He'd heard David's quiet sob as he'd gathered what papers he could and hurried away, heard the laughter following him down the hallway, heard Blake's voice saying something about pathetic losers who can't even keep track of their homework. But he'd also heard something else in Blake's voice, a speculative tone suggesting the performance had been as much about testing the audience as humiliating David. Blake had been watching other students, gauging their reactions, seeing who showed sympathy, who looked like they might interfere, who might need to be brought into line. And Ethan had the uncomfortable feeling that his own careful neutrality hadn't gone unnoticed. That feeling had been confirmed during lunch, when Blake had made his first direct approach. Ethan had been sitting at his usual table, methodically working through another of his father's sandwiches, when a shadow fell across his food. He'd looked up to find Blake standing beside his table, that trademark smile firmly in place. "Mind if I sit?" Blake had asked, but he was already sliding into the seat across from Ethan before receiving an answer. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Blake Sterling." "Ethan Cole," Ethan had replied, keeping his voice neutral and his body language relaxed. His father had taught him that initial moments of any encounter established tone for everything following, and that displaying either weakness or aggression could escalate situations beyond control. "Cole," Blake had repeated, as if testing the name. "You new here this year?" "Yeah, my dad's military, got transferred to the base." Cool, Blake had nodded. "I was just thinking, you seem like a smart guy." Quiet, observant. "I like that in people. Shows you know how to mind your own business." The words had been complimentary, but there was an edge underneath that Ethan had recognized immediately. This wasn't casual conversation. It was a recruitment pitch or possibly a warning. Blake was either trying to bring him into his circle or ensuring he understood the consequences of staying outside it. "I try to focus on my studies," Ethan had said carefully. "My dad's military, so we move around a lot. I've learned it's easier to just keep my head down and do my work." "Smart," Blake had agreed. "Very smart." "Military family, huh? That explains a lot. You've got that disciplined look about you. I bet your dad taught you all kinds of interesting things." Ethan had tensed slightly at that, though he'd been careful not to let it show. Blake was fishing, trying to determine what kind of threat Ethan might represent. The question was whether he was worried about Ethan as a potential rival or simply trying to gauge his usefulness as a potential ally. "He taught me the value of staying out of other people's business," Ethan had said, hoping to establish himself as someone who wouldn't interfere with Blake's activities. Blake's smile had widened at that, becoming somehow more genuine and more dangerous simultaneously. "I can respect that. We should definitely hang out sometime. I think we could be friends." But even as he'd said it, Ethan had caught something else in Blake's expression, a calculating look suggesting this conversation wasn't as casual as it appeared. Blake was making mental notes, filing away information about the new student who was smart enough to stay quiet, but might also be dangerous enough to require watching. The conversation had ended with Blake clapping him on the shoulder, a gesture that looked friendly but felt more like a claim being staked. "See you around, Ethan. Remember what we talked about?" Ethan had nodded and watched Blake return to his table, where he'd immediately been surrounded by his crew, all of them leaning in to hear about his conversation with the new kid. Ethan had seen Ryan's eyes narrow as Blake spoke, seen Kevin nod enthusiastically at whatever Blake was telling them, seen Nicole Hart pull out her phone and start typing rapidly. He'd realized then that his period of invisibility was over. Blake had noticed him, which meant he was now part of the school's social ecosystem, whether he wanted to be or not. The question was whether Blake saw him as a potential asset or a potential threat. And Ethan had the sinking feeling that the answer to that question would determine how the rest of his senior year played out. That night, he'd called his father at the base, ostensibly to check in, but really to seek guidance about his deteriorating situation. Colonel Cole had listened patiently as Ethan described the school's social dynamics, the bullying he'd witnessed, and his own efforts to stay neutral. "Son," his father had said when Ethan finished, "staying neutral isn't the same as staying honorable. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing at all." "But you taught me to avoid unnecessary conflicts," Ethan had protested. "You said the strongest person is the one who doesn't have to prove it." "I also taught you that strength without purpose is worthless," his father had replied, "and that sometimes the only way to maintain peace is to be prepared for war. You don't start fights, Ethan, but you don't let injustice continue when you have the power to stop it. What if fighting back just makes things worse? Then you make sure you win quickly and completely enough that there isn't an opportunity for things to get worse." The conversation had left Ethan more conflicted than ever. His father's wisdom was sound, but practical application in a high school environment was complicated by factors military training hadn't prepared him for. In the military, conflicts had clear objectives and defined rules of engagement. In high school, everything was subjective, personal, driven by emotions and social dynamics that could shift without warning. But he'd also begun to understand that his attempts to stay neutral weren't protecting him. They were just delaying the inevitable confrontation that Blake seemed to be orchestrating. Every day that passed, he could feel the net tightening around him, feel Blake's attention becoming more focused, more predatory. The breaking point had come during his 4th week at Westfield, on a Friday afternoon that had started like any other. Ethan had been walking to his car after school, looking forward to a weekend of training with his father and catching up on accumulating homework. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few scattered vehicles belonging to students staying late for various activities. He'd been fishing his keys from his pocket when he'd heard it, a sound that every part of his training had taught him to recognize. The sound of someone in distress, muffled but urgent, coming from behind the maintenance building at the parking lot's far edge. Ethan had paused, every instinct telling him to walk away, to get in his car and drive home and pretend he hadn't heard anything. Whatever was happening back there wasn't his business, wasn't his responsibility. He was the new kid, the one who minded his own business, the one who stayed out of other people's problems. But his father's voice had echoed in his mind. "Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing at all." He'd locked his car and walked across the parking lot, his footsteps silent on the asphalt, his senses hyper-alert for any sign of danger. As he'd gotten closer to the maintenance building, the sounds had become clearer. Multiple voices, at least one familiar, all of them ugly with the kind of excitement that came from exercising power over someone helpless. Ethan had reached the building's corner and carefully peered around it, using surveillance techniques his father had taught him to assess the situation without exposing himself. What he'd seen had made his blood run cold and his hands clench involuntarily into fists. David Park was on the ground again, but this time it wasn't just papers scattered around him. His shirt was torn, his lip was bleeding, and his glasses lay broken several feet away. Blake's entire crew was there. Blake himself, Ryan Walsh, Kevin Price, and 2 others Ethan didn't recognize. They were taking turns kicking at David. Not hard enough to cause serious injury, but hard enough to hurt, hard enough to humiliate, hard enough to make their point. "Come on, David," Blake was saying, his voice calm and reasonable despite what his feet were doing. "All you have to do is admit it. Admit that you're a pathetic loser who doesn't deserve to share the same air as normal people." David had tried to curl into a ball to protect himself, but every time he'd moved, one of them had kicked him back into position. "Please," he'd whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please stop." "I didn't do anything to you." "That's the problem," Ryan had laughed, delivering a particularly vicious kick to David's ribs. "You exist." That's what you did wrong. You exist in our space, breathing our air, making our school look bad with your pathetic existence. Maybe we should do something about that, Kevin suggested, and Ethan had seen him reach into his backpack and pull out what looked like a length of rope. Maybe we should make sure David understands exactly how unwelcome he is here. Blake had grinned at that, an expression of pure malevolent joy. That's a great idea, Kevin. David, you've been such a good sport about our little games, but I think it's time we played something a little more permanent. They'd hauled David to his feet, and Ethan had seen the terror in the smaller boy's eyes as Kevin had begun fashioning the rope into a noose. This wasn't just bullying anymore. This was something that could leave David seriously injured or worse. This was the line that Ethan's father had always said must never be crossed, the point where standing by became complicity in something unforgivable. "Hold his arms," Blake had instructed Ryan and one of the others. "Let's see how tough our little genius is when he can't breathe." That's when Ethan had made his decision. Not the careful, calculated decision of someone weighing tactical options, but the instant, absolute decision of someone who'd been trained from childhood to recognize when violence was not justified but necessary. He'd stepped around the building's corner, his movements fluid and silent, his mind automatically shifting into the combat state his father had drilled into him over countless training sessions. The world had seemed to slow down, sounds becoming muffled, his vision narrowing to focus on the threats and opportunities in front of him. "Let him go," Ethan had said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that his father used when giving orders that weren't open to debate. 5 heads had turned toward him, 5 faces registering different degrees of surprise, annoyance, and calculation. Blake had been the first to recover, his smile returning as he'd realized who had interrupted their fun. "Well, well," Blake had said, not releasing his grip on the rope. "Look who decided to join the party. Ethan Cole, right? I was wondering when you'd stop hiding behind that whole mind my own business act. See, this is your last warning," Ethan had said, taking a step closer. "Let him go and walk away." Ryan had laughed at that, a sound like breaking glass. "Or what? You'll tell the principal? File a complaint? Face it, hero, there's 5 of us and 1 of you. The smart play is to turn around and pretend you never saw anything." "Actually," Ethan had said, his voice still calm, but with an edge that anyone with survival instincts would have recognized as dangerous, "the smart play would be for you to listen to what I just told you." But Blake had been too intoxicated by his own power, too confident in his position as Westfield High's apex predator to recognize the shift in dynamics taking place in front of him. Instead of de-escalating, he'd chosen to escalate. "You know what, Ethan?" Blake had said, beginning to loop the makeshift noose around David's neck. "I think you need to learn the same lesson David here is learning. I think you need to understand exactly how things work at this school." He'd nodded to the 2 students Ethan didn't recognize, both of them larger than Ethan, both of them moving with the kind of swagger that suggested they'd never encountered anyone capable of serious resistance. They'd started toward Ethan with the casual confidence of predators approaching what they assumed was easy prey. Ethan had waited until they were close enough, had let them think they had the advantage, had allowed them to commit to their course of action before he'd moved. His father had taught him that the element of surprise was often more valuable than superior numbers or size, and that the key to winning any fight was to end it before your opponents realized it had really begun. The first student had reached for Ethan's shoulder, probably intending to grab him and hold him while the others prepared whatever humiliation they had planned. Instead, Ethan had stepped slightly to the side, grabbed the reaching arm and used the student's own momentum and body weight to send him flying into the maintenance building's wall with a sickening thud. The second student had had just enough time to register what had happened to his friend before Ethan's elbow had connected with his solar plexus, dropping him to his knees and leaving him gasping for air that wouldn't come. The whole exchange had taken perhaps 3 seconds, and suddenly the numerical advantage that had seemed so decisive was cut in half. But more importantly, the dynamic of the entire confrontation had shifted. Ethan was no longer the weak new kid who could be easily intimidated. He was something else entirely, something that Blake's experience hadn't prepared him to handle. "That was your first mistake," Ethan had said, his voice still calm as he'd stepped over the gasping student and moved closer to where Blake still held the rope around David's neck. "Don't make a second one." For the first time since Ethan had known him, Blake had looked uncertain. The easy confidence was still there, but underneath it was something that might have been fear. Kevin had taken a step backward, his face pale, as he'd realized that their simple game of domination had turned into something much more serious. But Ryan Walsh had always been the most unstable member of their group, the one most likely to escalate when a situation called for retreat. Instead of backing down, he'd pulled out what looked like a knife, actually a sharp metal ruler that had been modified to have a more dangerous edge. "Big mistake, transfer boy," Ryan had snarled, his freckled face twisted with rage and humiliation. "Nobody disrespects us like that. Nobody." Ethan had assessed the weapon quickly. Dangerous but crude, more likely to cause messy wounds than clean kills, but definitely capable of serious harm if it connected with vital areas. Ryan was holding it wrong, like someone who'd seen knife fights in movies, but had never actually been trained in their use. But that actually made him more dangerous rather than less. Untrained fighters were unpredictable, likely to do something stupid that could result in accidental serious injury. "Put it down," Ethan had said. But even as the words left his mouth, he'd known Ryan was too far gone to listen to reason. The smaller boy was high on adrenaline and humiliation, desperate to prove that he wasn't weak, that he was still dangerous, despite what had just happened to his friends. Ryan had lunged forward, the improvised knife aimed at Ethan's chest in a wild, undisciplined attack that left him completely off balance. Ethan had stepped aside easily, grabbed Ryan's wrist, and applied a joint lock that had sent the weapon spinning away across the concrete while simultaneously dropping Ryan face first onto the ground with his arm twisted behind his back, in a position that would have resulted in a broken limb if he'd struggled. "Stay down," Ethan had advised, applying just enough pressure to make his point clear. But the real confrontation was still ahead of him. Blake and Kevin still had David, and the makeshift noose was still around the smaller boy's neck. Blake's face had gone through several emotional transitions during Ethan's brief engagement with his subordinates. Surprise, calculation, anger, and finally a kind of cold fury that suggested he was about to do something desperately stupid. "You think you're hot shit," Blake had said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "You think because you know a few kung fu moves, you can just walk in here and disrupt our business?" "I think," Ethan had replied, releasing Ryan and stepping closer to Blake, "that you're about to do something that'll get you expelled, arrested, and possibly sent to adult prison. I think you need to take a step back and consider whether whatever this is supposed to prove is worth the next 10 years of your life." "The only thing I need to prove," Blake had snarled, "is that nobody messes with Blake Sterling and gets away with it." He'd tightened his grip on the rope, and David had made a choking sound that had sent ice through Ethan's veins. This had gone beyond simple bullying, beyond even the kind of serious assault that might result in suspension or expulsion. Blake was actively threatening David's life, and the wild look in his eyes suggested he was past the point of rational decision-making. "Kevin!" Blake had snapped without taking his eyes off Ethan. "Grab the other end of this rope. We're going to show our new friend here what happens to people who don't know their place." Kevin had hesitated, his face pale as he'd realized exactly what Blake was asking him to do. "Blake, man, maybe we should just—" "Grab the rope!" Blake had screamed, his composure finally cracking completely. "Now!" And Kevin, weak and desperate for approval as always, had reached for the rope despite the obvious terror in his eyes. Ethan had realized in that moment that reasoning wasn't going to work, that de-escalation wasn't possible, that the only way to save David's life was to end this confrontation quickly and decisively. His father had taught him that there were times when violence wasn't just justified, but necessary, when the failure to act would result in greater harm than action. This was one of those times. David's life was in immediate danger, and Ethan was the only person in a position to do something about it. He'd moved with the kind of explosive speed that only came from years of disciplined training, crossing the distance between himself and Blake in 2 quick steps. His hand had shot out and grabbed the rope, not to pull it away, but to control it, to make sure that any struggle wouldn't result in David being accidentally strangled. Blake had tried to jerk the rope away, putting even more pressure on David's neck, and that had been the moment when Ethan's restraint had finally snapped. This wasn't about school politics anymore, wasn't about bullying or social hierarchies or teenage drama. This was about someone trying to seriously hurt another person, and Ethan had been trained his entire life to stop that from happening. His free hand had shot forward and grabbed Blake by the throat, not to strangle him, but to control his head and neck, to put him in a position where he couldn't use leverage to pull on the rope. Blake's eyes had gone wide with shock and the beginning of panic as he'd realized that he was suddenly the one who couldn't breathe easily. "Let go of the rope," Ethan had said, his voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that brooked no argument. "Right now." But Blake, drunk on power and unable to accept that someone might actually be stronger than him, had tried to knee Ethan in the groin instead of complying. Ethan had blocked the knee easily, had used Blake's own movement to unbalance him, and then had done something that ended the confrontation once and for all. The throw had been perfect. A classic hip toss that had used Blake's size and momentum against him, sending him flying through the air to land hard on his back with an impact that had knocked all the air out of his lungs. The rope had flown from his hands as he tried to break his fall, finally freeing David, who had collapsed to his knees, gasping and clawing at his throat. Kevin had taken one look at Blake, writhing on the ground, gasping for breath, and had simply run. No words, no threats, no attempts to help his friends, just pure panic and the overwhelming need to be somewhere else. Ethan had let him go, recognizing that Kevin wasn't a real threat, just a follower who'd gotten in over his head. That left Ryan, who was still on the ground with his arm twisted behind his back, and Blake, who was slowly recovering his breath and his composure. Ethan had stood over them both, ready to respond to any further aggression, but also hoping desperately that they'd finally learned their lesson. "This is over," Ethan had said, looking down at Blake. "You're going to leave David alone. You're going to leave me alone. You're going to find some other way to feel important that doesn't involve hurting people who can't fight back." Blake had struggled to his feet, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. For a moment, Ethan had thought he might be smart enough to cut his losses and walk away. But Blake Sterling had never learned to accept defeat gracefully, had never developed the kind of emotional maturity that would have allowed him to back down from a confrontation he couldn't win. "This isn't over," Blake had snarled, his voice hoarse from Ethan's grip on his throat. "You think you won something here? You think this changes anything? I own this school, Cole. I own everyone in it. And sooner or later, you're going to learn that." He'd helped Ryan to his feet, both of them moving carefully as they'd tested for serious injuries, both of them shooting looks of pure hatred at Ethan as they'd gathered their scattered belongings. The 2 students who'd first approached Ethan were still leaning against the maintenance building, looking dazed and uncertain about whether the fight was really over. "Come on," Blake had said to his crew, his voice carrying forced bravado. "Let's get out of here. We've got better things to do than waste time on losers." They'd left, but not before Blake had turned back one more time to stare at Ethan with the kind of cold calculation that suggested he was already planning his revenge. Ethan had watched them go, knowing that he'd made an enemy for life, knowing that this confrontation had solved one problem while creating a dozen others. But David was safe. That was what mattered. The smaller boy was sitting on the ground, his back against the maintenance building, gingerly touching his throat and trying to process what had just happened. His broken glasses lay nearby, the lenses cracked beyond repair, but he was alive and mostly unhurt. "You okay?" Ethan had asked, kneeling down beside David and checking for signs of serious injury. David had nodded, though his hands were shaking and his voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you. I thought they were really going to—" "They were," Ethan had said grimly. "That's why I had to stop them." "But you could get in trouble," David had protested. "If they report this, if they say you attacked them—" Ethan had considered that. Blake and his crew would certainly try to spin the story to their advantage, would probably claim that Ethan had been the aggressor, that they'd just been having a conversation with David when the new kid had gone crazy and attacked them. Without witnesses, it would be their word against his, and they had the advantage of numbers and established relationships with the school administration. But Ethan had also recognized something important. Blake's behavior had crossed a line that even his usual protections couldn't cover. The makeshift noose, the threats of strangulation, the clear intent to cause serious harm, those weren't things that could be easily explained away as harmless pranking. If the story came out, if there was any kind of investigation, Blake would have some very difficult questions to answer. "Let them report it," Ethan had said finally. Let them try to explain what they were doing with that rope. He'd helped David to his feet, had made sure the smaller boy could walk without. Assistants had even helped him gather his scattered belongings. As they'd walked back toward the parking lot, David had been quiet, processing not just the physical trauma of what had happened, but the larger implications of what Ethan's intervention meant. "Why did you help me?" David had asked as they'd reached Ethan's car. "You could have just walked away." Everyone else always does. Ethan had considered the question, thinking about his father's teachings, about the principles he'd been raised to uphold, about the kind of person he wanted to be, regardless of the consequences. "Because it was the right thing to do," he'd said simply. "Because everyone deserves to be safe at school. Because no one should have to face something like that alone." David had nodded, tears streaming down his face. Not tears of pain, but tears of relief and gratitude, and the overwhelming emotion that came from discovering that he wasn't as alone as he'd thought. "If they come after you because of this," David had said, "if they try to get revenge—" "Let me worry about that," Ethan had replied. "You just focus on staying safe and getting through the rest of the school year." But even as he'd said it, Ethan had known that Blake Sterling wasn't the type to let a humiliation like this go unanswered. The confrontation behind the maintenance building had been a declaration of war, and Blake had the resources, the connections, and the ruthless intelligence to make Ethan's life very difficult in the weeks and months to come. The question was whether Ethan was ready for that war, and whether his father's training had prepared him for the kind of psychological and social warfare that Blake specialized in. He'd driven home that evening with a sense of foreboding that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the recognition that his life at Westfield High was about to become much more complicated. He'd done the right thing, had probably saved David from serious injury or worse, but he'd also painted a target on his back that would make him Blake's primary focus for the foreseeable future. That night, he'd called his father again, this time to report what had happened and to seek guidance about how to handle the inevitable retaliation. Colonel Cole had listened to the entire story without interruption, asking only a few pointed questions about the specifics of the confrontation and the nature of the threats that had been made. "You did the right thing," his father had said when Ethan finished. "I'm proud of you for standing up when it mattered, for using your training to protect someone who couldn't protect himself." "But now I've got a target on my back," Ethan had pointed out. "Blake's not going to let this go. He's going to come after me with everything he's got." "Probably," his father had agreed. "But here's what you need to understand, son. You already had a target on your back. Blake Sterling was always going to come after you eventually. Predators like him can sense strength, can smell potential threats to their dominance. The only difference is that now he knows what he's dealing with. So what do I do? You stay alert, you stay prepared, and you remember everything I've taught you about winning wars instead of just winning battles. Blake's going to try to destroy you socially before he tries to destroy you physically. He's going to try to isolate you, turn people against you, make you seem like the aggressor. Be ready for that. And if it goes beyond social warfare, then you end it quickly and completely, just like you did today. But Dad, his father's voice had carried a note of warning that Ethan had never heard before. If it does come to that, if Blake forces you into another physical confrontation, you make absolutely sure that it's the last one. You understand me? Ethan had understood. His father wasn't just talking about winning a fight. He was talking about winning so decisively that no one would ever think about challenging him again. It was a principle from military strategy. When diplomacy fails and violence becomes necessary, you use overwhelming force to ensure that the conflict ends permanently. But Ethan had also hoped it wouldn't come to that. He'd hoped that the confrontation behind the maintenance building would be enough to make Blake reconsider his approach, that the humiliation of being beaten by someone he'd underestimated would convince him to find easier targets. He'd been wrong about that. Monday morning had brought the first indication of how Blake intended to respond to his defeat. Ethan had arrived at school to find that someone had spray-painted "Psycho" across his locker in red letters that looked disturbingly like blood. It was crude but effective, the kind of thing that would be seen by hundreds of students before maintenance staff could clean it up, the kind of thing that would plant seeds of doubt about Ethan's stability and character. But that had been just the beginning. Over the next few days, Ethan had discovered the full extent of Blake's reach and influence within the school's social ecosystem. Rumours had begun circulating, stories about Ethan attacking innocent students, about his supposed history of violence at previous schools, about his family's alleged connections to criminal organisations. The rumours were obviously false to anyone who cared to investigate them, but they were crafted with just enough plausibility to seem believable to people who didn't know Ethan well. They painted him as a dangerous outsider, someone who couldn't be trusted, someone who might snap without warning and hurt people around him. The effect had been exactly what Blake had intended. Students who had previously been friendly or neutral toward Ethan had begun avoiding him. Conversations had stopped when he entered rooms. Teachers had started watching him with the kind of heightened attention usually reserved for known troublemakers. Blake had also enlisted Nicole Hart to wage war on social media. Posts had appeared on various platforms, carefully worded messages about feeling unsafe at school, about worrying that certain students might be bringing violence into what should be a safe learning environment. The posts never mentioned Ethan by name, but they were tagged with enough identifying information that anyone following the school's social media ecosystem would know exactly who was being discussed. It had been a masterful campaign of character assassination, designed to isolate Ethan and make him seem like the aggressor in any future conflicts. Blake was setting the stage for a narrative in which Ethan was the dangerous new kid who couldn't control his violent impulses, and Blake and his friends were the innocent victims just trying to get through school safely. But Blake's most effective weapon had been the way he'd turned Ethan's intervention to save David into evidence of his supposedly unstable character. According to the rumours Blake was spreading, Ethan hadn't saved David from a dangerous situation. He'd overreacted to harmless teasing, had attacked students who were just having fun, had shown that he was the kind of person who solved problems with violence instead of words. The genius of this approach was that it contained just enough truth to be believable. Ethan had used physical force against Blake and his friends. He had hurt people. The fact that he'd been protecting someone who was in genuine danger got lost in the retelling, buried under Blake's carefully crafted narrative of victimization and fear. Ethan had found himself in an impossible situation. Defending himself against the rumours only made him seem more defensive, more guilty. Staying silent allowed the stories to spread unchallenged. Either way, Blake was winning the social warfare that his father had warned him about. The breaking point had come exactly 2 weeks after the confrontation behind the maintenance building. Ethan had been eating lunch at his usual table, trying to ignore the whispered conversations and pointed stares from nearby students, when David Park had approached him with obvious nervousness. "Ethan," David had said quietly, sliding into the seat across from him, "I need to tell you something." Ethan had looked up from his sandwich, noting the fear in David's eyes, the way the smaller boy kept glancing around as if worried about being overheard. "What's up?" "Blake came to see me yesterday," David had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He made me an offer." Ethan had felt ice forming in his stomach. "What kind of offer?" "He said if I went to the principal and told them that you attacked his friends unprovoked, that you were the aggressor in what happened behind the maintenance building, he'd stop bothering me. He'd leave me alone for the rest of the year." The brilliance of Blake's strategy had been immediately clear to Ethan. If David recanted his story, if he claimed that Ethan had been the aggressor, it would destroy any credibility Ethan had with the school administration. It would confirm all the rumors Blake had been spreading, would turn Ethan from a hero into a villain in the official record. "And if you don't?" Ethan had asked, though he'd already known the answer. "He said things would get much worse for me," David had admitted, tears forming in his eyes. "He said what happened before was just the beginning, that he and his friends had lots of creative ideas about how to make my life hell." Ethan had sat back in his chair, processing this information and recognizing it for what it was, a master stroke of psychological manipulation. Blake had identified the one person whose testimony could destroy Ethan's credibility, and he was using the threat of renewed bullying to coerce that person into betraying the one person who had tried to help him. "I don't want to do it," David had continued. "You saved my life. You stood up for me when no one else would. But Ethan, I can't go through that again. I'm not strong like you. I can't fight them off." Ethan had looked across the cafeteria and seen Blake watching them, that familiar smile playing across his lips as he'd observed the conversation. Blake had known exactly what he was doing, had known that this moment would come, had probably been counting on it from the beginning. "Do what you have to do," Ethan had said finally, surprising David with his calm acceptance. "I understand. But if I lie about what happened, then you'll be doing what you need to do to survive," Ethan had said firmly. "I don't blame you for that. I won't blame you for that." David had broken down crying then, overwhelmed by guilt and fear and the impossible position Blake had put him in. Ethan had reached across the table and put a hand on the smaller boy's shoulder, offering what comfort he could while simultaneously feeling his own options narrowing to almost nothing. Blake had won this round. By threatening David, by forcing him to choose between his integrity and his safety, Blake had found a way to turn Ethan's greatest strength, his willingness to protect others, into a weakness that could be exploited. But Ethan had also recognized something important in that moment. Blake's need to destroy him, to erase any trace of the humiliation he'd suffered, had revealed just how threatened he felt by Ethan's presence. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about Blake's fundamental sense of security and dominance within the school's hierarchy. That evening, Ethan had walked into his father's home office with a sense of grim determination. Colonel Cole had been working on reports, but he'd set them aside when he'd seen the expression on his son's face. "It's escalating," Ethan had said without preamble. And then he'd explained everything. The rumors, the social media campaign, the pressure on David to recant his story. His father had listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, his expression growing more serious as the full scope of Blake's campaign became clear. "He's good," Colonel Cole had said when Ethan finished. "Smarter than the average high school bully. He understands psychological warfare, understands how to control narratives and manipulate social dynamics. So what do I do? You recognize that this isn't going to end with social warfare, his father had said grimly. Blake's invested too much in destroying you to back down now. Eventually, probably soon, he's going to escalate to physical confrontation again. And when he does, you need to be ready. Ready how? Ready to end it permanently, his father had said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned military experience. Blake's shown you who he is, Ethan. He's shown you that he's willing to threaten innocent people to get what he wants, that he has no moral boundaries, that he won't stop until he's completely destroyed you or you've completely destroyed him. You're saying I should start a fight? I'm saying you should be prepared to finish one, his father had corrected. And when the time comes, and it will come, you make sure that Blake Sterling never wants to fight anyone ever again. The conversation had left Ethan with a cold certainty about what was coming. Blake wasn't going to be satisfied with social victory. He was going to want physical revenge for the humiliation he'd suffered. And when that moment came, Ethan would need to be ready to respond with the kind of overwhelming force that would end the conflict permanently. He'd spent the next few days preparing mentally and physically, not the kind of preparation that involved weapons or planning attacks, but the mental and physical preparation that his father had taught him over years of training. He'd reviewed techniques for dealing with multiple attackers, had practiced the kind of defensive and offensive combinations that could end a fight quickly and decisively, had prepared himself psychologically for the possibility that he might need to seriously hurt people in order to protect himself and others. The call to war had come on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by Kevin Price with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was working up the courage to deliver a message he didn't really want to give. Ethan had been at his locker gathering books for his final class of the day when Kevin had approached with obvious reluctance. "Blake wants to see you," Kevin had said without preamble. "Does he now?" Ethan had replied, not turning around from his locker. "And what makes Blake think I want to see him?" "He said to tell you that it's about David," Kevin had continued, his voice becoming more strained. "He said you'd understand what that means." Ethan had understood perfectly. Blake was using David as leverage again, threatening the smaller boy to force Ethan into a confrontation. It was exactly the kind of move Ethan had expected, cruel, effective, and designed to put Ethan in an impossible position. "Where and when?" Ethan had asked, finally turning to face Kevin. "Behind the gym after school, just you and him," he said. "No one else needs to get involved." Ethan had almost laughed at that. Blake Sterling doing anything just him without backup was about as likely as snow in August. But Ethan had also recognized that this was the moment his father had predicted, the moment when Blake's need for revenge would override his usual caution and intelligence. "Tell Blake I'll be there," Ethan had said. "And Kevin, you might want to find somewhere else to be this afternoon." Kevin had nodded quickly and hurried away, leaving Ethan to contemplate what was about to happen. He'd known it was a trap, had known that Blake would have every advantage he could arrange, superior numbers, weapons, whatever it took to ensure victory. But Ethan had also known that running wasn't an option, not when David's safety was being used as leverage. That afternoon, as the final bell had rung and students had begun streaming out of the building, Ethan had made his way toward the gym with the calm focus that came from absolute certainty about what needed to be done. He'd texted his father a simple message. "It's time." He'd checked that his phone was fully charged and easily accessible. He'd mentally reviewed the techniques that would be most effective against multiple attackers in an outdoor environment. Most importantly, he'd prepared himself for the possibility that this confrontation might end with serious injuries, either his own or those of his opponents. His father had taught him that hesitation in a real fight could be fatal, that when survival was at stake, mercy was a luxury that could get you killed. The area behind the gym was secluded, hidden from the main parking lot by the building itself and from the athletic fields by a line of trees. It was the perfect place for the kind of confrontation that couldn't be easily witnessed or interrupted, which meant Blake had chosen it for exactly those reasons. Ethan had arrived to find not just Blake waiting for him, but his entire crew. Ryan Walsh, Kevin Price, and 3 other students Ethan recognized but had never spoken to. They were spread out in a loose semicircle, positioned to prevent Ethan from easily escaping, while also giving themselves room to maneuver. But it was what Blake was holding that had made Ethan's blood run cold. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a length of chain, probably taken from some piece of gym equipment, heavy enough to cause serious damage if used properly. The others had similar improvised weapons, pipes, boards, things that could cause major injury while still being explained away as whatever happened to be available. "Glad you could make it, Ethan," Blake had said, his voice carrying false friendliness over genuine malice. "I was hoping we could finish our conversation from the other day." "Let me guess," Ethan had replied, assessing distances and angles, noting potential weapons and escape routes. "David is somewhere safe as long as I cooperate with whatever you've got planned." "David is fine," Blake had said with a grin, "for now, but his continued safety depends entirely on how this conversation goes." Ethan had realized then that Blake had learned from their previous encounter. He wasn't going to make the mistake of underestimating Ethan again, wasn't going to assume that numbers and intimidation would be enough. This time, he was prepared for a real fight, armed, organized, and absolutely committed to winning regardless of the cost. "Here's how this is going to work," Blake had continued, beginning to swing the chain in a slow, hypnotic circle. "You're going to get down on your knees and apologize for interfering in my business. You're going to admit that you're nothing but a psychotic freak who doesn't belong in civilized society. And then we're going to teach you a lesson about what happens to people who don't know their place. And if I refuse, then we're going to teach you that lesson anyway," Ryan said with obvious anticipation. "But it's going to hurt a lot more." Ethan had looked around the circle of faces, seeing the excitement in their eyes, the anticipation of violence that suggested this wasn't just about revenge anymore. Blake had whipped them into a state where they were looking forward to hurting him, where the violence was an end in itself rather than a means to an end. "You know what the funny thing is," Ethan had said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "My father warned me this would happen. He said people like you can't accept being beaten, can't handle the idea that someone might be stronger than you." "Your father?" Blake had laughed. "Where is Daddy now, Ethan? He's not here to save you." "He doesn't need to be," Ethan had replied. "He already taught me everything I need to know." That's when Blake had made his move, whipping the chain toward Ethan's head with vicious intent. But Ethan had been ready for it, had been watching Blake's body language, had seen the attack coming before Blake had even begun to move. Ethan had ducked under the chain and stepped forward, closing the distance before Blake could recover his balance. His hand had shot out and grabbed Blake's wrist, controlling the weapon while simultaneously positioning himself for a counterattack. But this time, Blake had been ready for that response. Instead of trying to pull away, he'd stepped into Ethan, trying to use his superior size and weight to overpower the smaller boy. At the same time, Ryan had moved in from the side with his improvised club, trying to catch Ethan between them. Ethan had responded with a technique his father had drilled into him for exactly this situation, dealing with multiple attackers who were trying to overwhelm him with superior numbers. He'd used Blake's own momentum against him, pulling instead of pushing, sending the larger boy stumbling forward while simultaneously spinning to face Ryan's attack. The club had whistled past Ethan's head as he dropped into a crouch, sweeping Ryan's legs and sending him crashing to the ground. As Ryan had fallen, Ethan had grabbed the club from his hands and straightened up in time to face the next attacker. Kevin had been coming at him with what looked like a piece of rebar, swinging it like a baseball bat in a wild, undisciplined attack that had left him completely vulnerable. Ethan had stepped inside the swing, blocked Kevin's arm with the club he'd taken from Ryan, and delivered an elbow strike to Kevin's solar plexus that had dropped him like a stone. 3 down in less than 10 seconds, but Ethan hadn't had time to celebrate. Blake had recovered from his stumble and was coming at him again, the chain spinning in complex patterns that showed he'd actually practiced with the weapon. The other 3 attackers were moving in from different angles, trying to surround Ethan and overwhelm him with superior numbers. This was exactly the kind of situation his father had prepared him for, outnumbered, outgunned, fighting for his life against opponents who had no intention of stopping until he was seriously injured or worse. It was the moment when everything he'd learned, everything he'd trained for, would either save his life or prove insufficient. Ethan had made a decision in that split second. Not the careful, considered decision of someone with time to weigh options, but the instant, absolute decision of a trained fighter who understood that survival meant taking the initiative and never giving it back. He'd thrown the club at the nearest attacker, not trying to hurt him but to distract him and force him to dodge. While the boy had been flinching away, Ethan had closed the distance to Blake, who was still trying to get his chain into position for another attack. But instead of going for Blake directly, Ethan had done something that none of them had expected. He'd grabbed the chain itself, wrapping it around his forearm and using it to pull Blake off balance while simultaneously preventing him from using it as a weapon. Blake had tried to release the chain, but Ethan hadn't let him. Instead, he'd used it like a leash, controlling Blake's movement while positioning himself to deal with the other attackers. When one of them had come at him from behind, Ethan had spun Blake around and used him as a human shield, forcing the attacker to pull back or risk hitting his own leader. The psychology of the moment had been perfect. Blake's followers had been operating under the assumption that they were the predators in this situation, that Ethan was just another victim waiting to be broken. But suddenly, they were seeing their leader being controlled and manipulated, being used as a tool against them, and it had shattered their confidence in their own superiority. Ethan had pressed that advantage ruthlessly. Still controlling Blake with the chain, he'd swept the legs of another attacker, sending him crashing into a third. When Ryan had tried to get back up, Ethan had kicked him in the ribs hard enough to keep him down. When Kevin had tried to crawl away, Ethan had stepped on his hand just hard enough to make his point clear. In less than a minute, Ethan had gone from being outnumbered 6-1 to having complete control of the situation. But more importantly, he'd done it in a way that demonstrated not just his physical superiority, but his tactical intelligence, his ability to think and adapt under pressure, his capacity for the kind of controlled violence that was far more intimidating than simple brutality. Blake had been struggling against the chain around his arm, his face red with rage and humiliation, as he'd realized that his carefully planned revenge had turned into another devastating defeat. "Let me go," Blake had snarled, trying to strike at Ethan with his free hand. Ethan had responded by yanking on the chain, sending Blake stumbling forward and forcing him to focus on maintaining his balance rather than attacking. "I don't think so," Ethan had said calmly. "We're going to finish this conversation first." "You're dead!" Blake had screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You hear me? You're dead. I'll destroy you. I'll destroy your family. Ethan had cut him off by tightening his grip on the chain and stepping closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more intimidating than any shout could have been. "No," Ethan had said quietly. "You won't." And then he'd done something that had surprised even himself. Instead of escalating the violence, instead of seriously hurting Blake and his friends the way they'd intended to hurt him, Ethan had made a different choice. He'd unwrapped the chain from his arm and let it fall to the ground, releasing Blake but making it clear that he was doing so from a position of complete dominance rather than weakness. "This is how it's going to work," Ethan had said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "You're going to leave David alone. You're going to leave me alone. You're going to find some other way to feel important that doesn't involve hurting people who can't fight back." Blake had backed away, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. But Ethan hadn't been finished. "And if you ever threaten another student the way you threatened David, if you ever put another rope around someone's neck, if you ever escalate to weapons again, I will end you. Not hurt you, not embarrass you, end you. Do you understand me?" The threat had been delivered in the same calm, conversational tone Ethan might have used to discuss the weather, but there had been something in his eyes that had made Blake take another step backward. "You can't threaten me," Blake had said, but his voice had lacked conviction. "I'll report this. I'll tell everyone what you did." "Go ahead," Ethan had replied. "Tell them how you and 5 friends ambushed one person with weapons and still lost. Tell them how you had to threaten an innocent kid to get me to show up. Tell them about the rope you put around David's neck. See how that story plays out." Blake had looked around at his friends, all of them still on the ground, all of them looking at him with expressions that ranged from confusion to outright fear. The dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone present had understood that Blake's reign of terror was over. "This isn't finished," Blake had said, but even he hadn't sounded like he believed it. "Yes," Ethan had replied, "it is." Blake and his crew had left, limping and helping each other, their improvised weapons abandoned on the ground behind the gym. Ethan had watched them go, knowing that word of this confrontation would spread through the school like wildfire, that the story would be told and retold until it became legend. But more importantly, he'd known that Blake Sterling would never again feel confident enough to terrorize innocent students. The psychological foundation of his bullying had been his belief in his own invincibility, his certainty that no one could or would stand up to him effectively. That foundation had been shattered, and without it, Blake was just another insecure teenager trying to make it through high school. Ethan had gathered the abandoned weapons and carried them to the nearest dumpster, erasing the evidence of what had happened while simultaneously sending a message that he wasn't looking for glory or recognition for what he'd done. This hadn't been about proving his own toughness. It had been about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. When he'd arrived at school the next morning, Ethan had found a very different environment waiting for him. The rumours and whispers were still there, but they had a different quality now. Instead of painting him as a dangerous psychopath, they portrayed him as someone who had stood up to the school's worst bullies and won decisively. Students who had previously avoided him now nodded respectfully when they passed him in the hallways. Teachers who had been watching him with suspicion now seemed to regard him with something approaching approval. Even the administration, while never officially acknowledging what had happened, seemed to understand that the school's bullying problem had been significantly reduced. David Park had approached him during lunch, his face glowing with something that might have been hero worship. "Is it true?" David had asked quietly. "Did you really take on Blake and all his friends by yourself?" "I did what needed to be done," Ethan had replied, uncomfortable with the attention but understanding its importance. "The important thing is that you're safe now." "Safe? Eh?" David had laughed, but it was a sound of joy rather than bitterness. "Ethan, for the first time since I started at this school, I actually feel like I belong here. You didn't just save me, you saved everyone Blake was terrorizing." And that had been true. Over the next few weeks, Ethan had watched as the social ecosystem of Westfield High had slowly reorganized itself around new dynamics. Without Blake's group dominating through fear and intimidation, other students had begun to assert themselves, to form new friendships, to take risks they'd previously been too afraid to take. The change hadn't been immediate or complete. There were still cliques and social hierarchies, still incidents of meanness and exclusion. But the particular brand of systematic terrorization that Blake had specialized in was gone, replaced by the normal ups and downs of teenage social life. Blake himself had become something of a pariah, avoided by former allies who no longer saw him as a source of protection and status. He'd tried for a while to rebuild his reputation, to find new ways to assert dominance, but the psychological impact of his defeat had been too complete. Every time he'd tried to intimidate someone, the memory of his humiliation behind the gym had undermined his credibility. By the spring semester, Blake had largely withdrawn from school social life entirely, focusing on his academics and keeping his head down in a way that would have been unthinkable during his reign as the school's primary predator. Some students had felt sorry for him, seeing his fall from grace as excessive punishment for teenage mistakes. But Ethan had remembered the rope around David's neck, had remembered the look in Blake's eyes when he'd been planning to use it, and had felt no sympathy whatsoever. Ethan himself had found his social position at Westfield completely transformed. Students who had previously ignored him now sought his friendship, not because they were afraid of him, but because they respected what he'd done and the way he'd done it. He'd become something he'd never expected to be, a leader, someone that others looked to for guidance and protection. But with that leadership had come responsibility. Younger students who were being bullied began approaching him for help. Teachers started referring problem situations to him informally, knowing that his intervention was often more effective than official disciplinary action. Parents of students who were having trouble had even called him directly, asking for advice about how to handle their children's social problems. Ethan had tried to handle these requests with the same principles his father had taught him, using the minimum force necessary, focusing on protection rather than punishment, always looking for ways to de-escalate rather than escalate. He'd become something like an unofficial guardian of Westfield High, maintaining order through the threat of consequences rather than through actual violence. The irony hadn't been lost on him that in trying to avoid conflict, he'd ended up in a position where managing conflict had become his primary responsibility. But he'd also recognized that this was exactly what his father had been preparing him for, not just the ability to fight when necessary, but the wisdom to know when fighting was the right choice and the restraint to know when it wasn't. His father had been proud of him, had told him that he'd handled an impossible situation with exactly the kind of judgment and skill that the military tried to instill in its best officers. "You didn't just win a fight," Colonel Cole had said. "You solved a problem. You made your school a safer place for everyone, and you did it without becoming the kind of person you were fighting against." That last point had been important to Ethan. He'd seen too many situations where the victims of bullying had become bullies themselves, where the cycle of violence had simply transferred from one group to another without actually solving anything. He'd been determined not to let that happen, to use his abilities responsibly and only when absolutely necessary. As his senior year had progressed and graduation had approached, Ethan had begun to understand that his experience at Westfield had been about more than just stopping a bully or protecting a vulnerable student. It had been about learning to balance strength with responsibility, about understanding when action was necessary and when restraint was, wiser, about becoming the kind of person who could be trusted with power because he understood its proper use. The lessons he'd learned from his father had been essential, but they hadn't been sufficient. The real education had come from applying those lessons in the complex, messy, emotionally charged environment of a real high school with real people facing real problems. He'd learned that every situation was unique, that there were no simple answers or universal solutions, that doing the right thing often required careful judgment and personal sacrifice. When graduation day had finally arrived, Ethan had been surprised by how many of his classmates had approached him to thank him for making their high school experience better. Students he'd barely spoken to had told him stories about how the changes he'd brought about had affected their lives, had given them the courage to stand up for themselves or others, had made them feel safer and more confident in their daily lives. David Park had been among them, of course, but he'd also been joined by dozens of others. Students who had been helped directly or indirectly by Ethan's intervention, students who had benefited from the changed social climate at Westfield, students who had simply been inspired by seeing someone stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. "You changed everything," David had told him during the graduation party. "Not just for me, but for everyone." Westfield is a better place because you are here." Ethan had accepted the thanks graciously, but he'd also understood that the real credit belonged to all the students who had chosen to be better, kinder, more courageous after seeing that change was possible. He'd simply been the catalyst. The real transformation had come from within the school community itself. As he'd prepared to leave for college, Ethan had reflected on what he'd learned during his time at Westfield High. He'd arrived as a quiet, unassuming new student trying to avoid attention and conflict. He'd left as someone who understood that avoiding conflict wasn't always possible or even desirable, that sometimes the greatest kindness was the willingness to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. His father's teachings had provided the foundation, but the experience had provided the wisdom to apply those teachings effectively. Ethan had learned that strength without compassion was mere brutality, that compassion without strength was mere sentiment, and that true leadership required the integration of both into something greater than either could achieve alone. The confrontation with Blake Sterling had lasted only minutes, but its effects had rippled out through the entire school community for months afterward. Students had learned that bullying didn't have to be tolerated, that someone would stand up for them if they couldn't stand up for themselves, that the social order could be changed if someone was brave enough to challenge it. Teachers had learned that sometimes the unofficial solutions were more effective than the official ones, that student leaders could accomplish things that administrative policies couldn't, that creating a safe learning environment sometimes required recognizing and supporting the natural protectors within the student body. Parents had learned that their children were capable of more courage and moral judgment than they'd given them credit for, that the lessons they'd tried to teach at home could find expression in the most unexpected ways, that the values they'd worked to instill could make a real difference in the world. And Ethan himself had learned that the greatest victory wasn't defeating an enemy, it was creating a world where such enemies couldn't thrive, where their tactics couldn't succeed, where their victims could find protection and support. He'd learned that true strength was measured not by the damage you could inflict, but by the damage you could prevent, not by the fear you could inspire, but by the safety you could provide. Years later, when Ethan had become an officer in his father's footsteps, when he'd led soldiers in actual combat situations, when he'd faced real enemies with real weapons in places where the stakes were life and death, he'd still thought back to that confrontation behind the Westfield High gym. He'd thought about Blake Sterling and the choice to show restraint when escalation would have been easier, about David Park and the responsibility that came with being able to protect others, about his father's wisdom and the difference between winning battles and solving problems. The lessons he'd learned at 17 had served him well in every challenge he'd faced since. The understanding that strength must be tempered with wisdom, that power must be balanced with responsibility, that the greatest victories were often the ones that prevented fights rather than winning them. These had become the foundation of his character and the guiding principles of his life. But perhaps most importantly, Ethan had learned that sometimes the smallest actions could have the greatest consequences, that standing up for one vulnerable person could change an entire community, that doing the right thing even when it was difficult could inspire others to do the same. The ripple effects of that single decision to help David Park had spread far beyond anything Ethan could have anticipated, touching lives and changing attitudes in ways that were still being felt years later. In the end, the story of Ethan Cole and Blake Sterling wasn't really about bullying or fighting or high school social dynamics. It was about the choice that every person faces when confronted with injustice, the choice to act or to remain silent, to stand up or to look away, to risk themselves for the sake of others or to preserve their own safety at the cost of their principles. Ethan had made his choice, and in doing so, he'd discovered who he really was and who he wanted to become. He'd learned that being strong wasn't about being able to hurt people. It was about being willing to protect them. He'd learned that being tough wasn't about being insensitive to others' pain. It was about being sensitive enough to recognize it and brave enough to do something about it. The confrontation had lasted minutes, but the lessons had lasted a lifetime. And in the years that followed, whenever Ethan encountered injustice or witnessed someone being victimized by those with more power, he'd remember David Park's pleading eyes and Blake Sterling's arrogant smile, and he'd know exactly what needed to be done. Some fights were worth having, not because they were easy to win, but because they were too important to lose. The fight for basic human dignity, for the right of every person to feel safe in their daily life, for the principle that strength should protect rather than prey upon weakness. These were fights that Ethan would never stop fighting, no matter what the cost. And sometimes, if he was very lucky and very skilled and very careful, he could win those fights in ways that made everyone involved better than they'd been before. Sometimes, if the stars aligned just right, he could find solutions that transformed enemies into allies, that turned moments of potential tragedy into opportunities for growth and understanding. But even when such perfect solutions weren't possible, when the best he could do was stop the immediate harm and hope for better outcomes in the future, Ethan knew that the effort was worthwhile. Every David Park who was protected, every Blake Sterling who was stopped, every school or workplace or community that was made a little bit safer. These were victories worth celebrating, regardless of how small they might seem in the larger scheme of things. The boy who had walked into Westfield High hoping to remain invisible had discovered that sometimes the most important thing you could do was to make sure that others could be seen, could be heard, could be safe. The quiet new student had learned that silence in the face of injustice was itself a form of violence, and that speaking up or fighting back was sometimes the most compassionate thing you could do. Ethan Cole had found his voice at Westfield High, and he'd used it to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. In doing so, he'd discovered not just who he was, but who he had the potential to become. The confrontation with Blake Sterling had been just the beginning of that journey, the first step in a lifetime dedicated to protecting those who needed protection and stopping those who would do harm. It was a journey that would take him far from the hallways of Westfield High, but he would never forget the lessons he'd learned there, or the moment when he'd first understood that true strength came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the willingness to serve them. The quiet new student had become something much more important than a fighter. He'd become a protector, a guardian, a force for justice in a world that desperately needed such forces. And that, in the end, was worth more than any victory in any fight could ever be.